To learn more about the topics discussed by Germinal Van in this lecture by the Dartmouth Libertarians, please read his book, The Economic Condition of Black America in the 20th Century, a historical and empirical analysis, which can be purchased both for Kindle and as a paperback version on Amazon. Link in the description below. The Dartmouth Libertarians are honored to be hosting political scientist Germinal G. Van for a discussion regarding the subject of his latest of 14 published books, The Condition of Black America in the 20th Century, a Historical and Economic Analysis. After immigrating to the U.S. from the Ivory Coast, West Africa, Mr. Van earned his B.A. from the Catholic University of America and his master's in political science from George Washington University. In addition to over a dozen scholarly publications, Mr. Van has also written articles for the Mises Institute and the Foundation for Economic Education. In light of recent developments in the realm of police brutality, civil rights, and racial justice, I'd like to begin the discussion by posing Mr. Van the following question. To what extent do you believe systemic discrimination is to blame for the depressed economic status of Black communities across the U.S., both historically and presently? Take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Jonathan, for having me here. I want to thank also the Dartmouth Libertarian Group. Thank you guys for having me on this platform. It's an honor. So now to answer your question, I personally believe that I will not say that systemic racism is a myth, but I will say that it is not relevant to the economic and social advancement of African Americans. Of course, racism exists. It has always existed. It will always be here. Unfortunately, it's a human scourge. But when we look at all the adversities that African Americans have faced throughout the history of the United States, they overcame more challenges than they were restrained. So to me, systemic racism is in fact on life support, as Thomas Sowell always said, but it is maintained by politicians, by community organizers, by political activists, by some celebrities who want to express their political views, although they're not experts at all on the issue. So it is maintained by these people, by those who need to always speak about racism in order to make themselves relevant and to bring significance upon themselves. Because if they stop talking about racism, no one will care. No one will even acknowledge them. So it's a need for them to always bring it up, because systemic racism on its own does no longer affect African Americans as it did during Jim Crow or during slavery or simply during racial segregation in the early 1900s. So it is no longer relevant. It's the same for white privilege too. And I made a video a couple weeks ago when I was expressing my contention with some conservatives talking about the fact that they call it white privilege is a myth. I don't think it's the right word to try to discredit white privilege. White privilege is not a myth. It has always existed, but the thing is that it is no longer relevant in the advancement of African Americans in the economic and social ladder. So white privilege, systemic racism, they are no longer relevant in Black people's advancement, I would say.
So given the clear discrepant rates of socioeconomic status, policing, and incarceration rates between the general population and the African American community in the United States, what is the solution or solutions? I'm sure it's a multivariate, complex problem moving forward. What has your research and experience and education in these areas, how has that informed your policy prescriptions?
So yes, it is true that Black people are disproportionately affected when it comes to mass incarceration. But there are simple things that create these problems. In the book, like when I was doing my research, I saw, for instance, that yes, white people are less incarcerated than Black people. But one of the reasons why is because, for instance, Black people do illegal stuff on the street instead of simply doing these things at home. We know for instance that marijuana now is legal, but at the time, even when it wasn't legal, Black people will, for instance, those who live in low-income neighborhood, they will simply smoke it outside in the public sphere in front of everyone, while, for instance, whites will smoke their marijuana at home. So if you smoke it at home, you're not infringing upon the liberty of others. But if you do it outside, where they're like parents and kids walking around, and you see the smell like going up on them, and it's disturbing. So it's those things. So it's those little things that the police focus on to make petty crimes becoming relevant, although they should not be relevant. So the solution that I propose, for instance, when it comes to mass incarceration, first of all, is that the police needs more training, because we have a lot of people who get in the police and their training lasts probably 6 months, and then they get on the streets, and because they have, the gun, the taser, and the handcuffs, they think that they're God. So they use that power over civilians to ascertain their own authority. And it usually results into what we saw, for instance, with George Floyd. So we need more rigorous training for the police officers who get into the academy. The police system needs to be reformed. People, on the other hand, those in the community, needs to also be educated. So we just don't want to make arrests for the sake of arresting people. We want to make lawful arrests. If we want to arrest someone, it has to be within the framework of due process. And due process is no longer respected, because when someone becomes a suspect, is automatically assumed to be guilty instead of being presumed to be innocent. So there's a lot of work to do on that one. But that was just a simple example I wanted to bring on. Like, is that there's just those little cultural features, for instance, between Black and white, that makes it different. But I'm not saying that it is only that, but this is one portion of it that increase mass incarceration for Black people. Because at the end of the day, one thing to understand is that the United States of America is a country of laws. We always say that one nation under God, but in fact, I personally believe that it is one nation under the law. The law here is God. So if you follow the law, if you follow the rule of law, 99% of the time, nothing will happen to you. Even the most racist person will not be able to harm you, because for the racist person to harm you, he needs to have a motive. And you need to give him a motive so that he can use that motive against you. But if you follow the law, if you do whatever you're told to be doing, you will be fine. I've been here for almost 10 years now. In August, it's going to be 10 years. I've been in the US. I've never been arrested a single time. Whether I drive or whether I walk on the street, I've never been arrested. So it's because I follow the law. I'm trying to do everything lawfully, legally. So I think that's the best way to also minimize all potential casualties. But it doesn't mean that racial profiling doesn't exist. It does exist. It's still, unfortunately, relevant in our society. So that's why the police needs a rigorous training in order to minimize those things.
And I really appreciate that answer regarding the incarceration aspect of the question. In terms of the socioeconomic and the more, wealth, income aspect, what do you think explains that gap between, let's say, white communities and others, and the Black community, and what impediments still exist, and how those can be overcome?
So it is interesting because everything is based on the economic system we have. By economic system, in fact, I mean the economic policies that are being implemented. In the 1920s, for example, which was the period of the Great Expansion, or the Roaring Years, or the Roaring 20s, my bad, Black self-unemployment was higher than white self-unemployment. The data is in the book. You guys can look it up. It's in chapter 3. Black people were creating more businesses for themselves. More Black people were lifted out of poverty in the 1920s. But why is that? It is because um, after the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, it was President Harding who came. And what did he do? He did nothing. He let the free market do his job. When he took power, there was, in fact, a recession at the time. And instead of injecting money in the economy to recover it and do all these Keynesian policies that we know, he simply cut taxes, especially corporate taxes. He also increased the purchasing powers for the ordinary citizen, but not doing much. He said, let the market recover on its own. And unemployment was, when Harding took power, unemployment was at 11%. It shrunk all the way to 2%. The data is there. You guys can look it up on Google whenever. But that's what happened. The market works. It wasn't until the Great Depression, when FDR took power, that things now started to get worse. However, the policies of FDR benefited Black people overall, especially those who were living in the North, because the Great Migration played a role in the economic advancement of Black people. Those who were living in the South remained backward mostly. So because of Jim Crow and the oppression, more Black people were moving toward the North and the West. So those areas were already industrialized. So with the industrialization and minimal regulations, what employers need an expanded workforce. So they were willing to hire whoever comes. That was even at the time before the minimum wage. So they were willing to hire anybody that would come and work for them. So even when the minimum wage was implemented, it did not have a substantial effect on Black people's income until the late 50s, early 60s. Why? Because inflation was so high that the minimum wage was meaningless. So a 16-year-old Black kid in the 1940s could easily get a job at the local store in his neighborhood, and he would be fine. So what decimated the socio-economic advancement of Black people was the welfare state. Because when the welfare state was implemented, despite all its good intentions, it destroyed the nuclear family. It forces the absence of Black fathers, and a family cannot move forward or cannot thrive if there is no fatherly figure within the family. Today, when we look at the typical Black family, you see a Black woman or Black mother with 4 or 5 kids from different fathers. The father is not here because if the father is here, the woman cannot get her paycheck from the government for the welfare benefits she's getting. And even the welfare benefits that she gets, she cannot even choose what she wants how she wants to consume the product that she's willing to under the welfare benefits that she gets. The government tells her. So that is to say, the welfare completely took the incentives out of low-income people. It's not just Blacks, but Blacks, Hispanic, or most minorities, but low-income people, generally speaking, even whites. A lot of whites under the welfare state. So it's low-income people. It took that incentive from them to look out for jobs and to emancipate themselves. It was Bill Clinton who tried to reduce that. Although he's a Democrat, Bill Clinton was actually more of a conservative president than most people can think of. His policies were very much on the right than on the left.
So despite everything you've said about the free market and kind of cutting back on regulation and taxes so that people have more purchasing power and are more easily able to get jobs, even in the 1920s, when I think we can all agree historically and just kind of anecdotally how we think about it, certainly a very racist time. You know, I'm sure a lot of white people, even in the North, wouldn't want to hire a Black person if they could hire a white person.
Yeah.
So not to deny that, it's 100% a phenomenon. But why do you think nowadays, I've been seeing online, there's this sentiment that to quote a post I saw from a fellow student, you must be anti-capitalist if you're trying to be anti-racist. And what you're telling me sounds like the opposite of that. So, and I believe that it's the case. So how do we get that message out and show that it's actually capitalism, which is necessary to uplift this community, which all good faith, kind-hearted Americans want to see happen? We want everybody, especially our fellow citizens and countrymen, better off.
So capitalism has a bad connotation. In fact, if you want to change people's mind or views about capitalism, first, it's better to change the semantic. Use the word free market instead of capitalism. Because today, like, Karl Marx was actually the first person to use the word capitalism. And of course, he used it in a derogatory sense. So everyone who reads it will associate capitalism with the pursuit of profit. But what people don't say is that capitalism is not just the pursuit of profit. You have the pursuit of profit, but you also have losses too. Because in order to succeed in a capitalistic society, you must fail first. And the US is the most anecdotal country when it comes to stories about like success. All these people who succeed, it didn't happen overnight. They started somewhere, they failed miserably for a long period of time before they were able to succeed. So capitalism is, first of all, a lot of dedication you have to put into the idea that you have in your mind. The idea that you try to materialize, you have to put a lot of dedication, you need to have a vision, you need to put the work ethics in it, and you need luck. You need to be at the right place at the right time with the right people. Because let me give you that very simple example. That book I'm talking to you about, imagine Cristiano Ronaldo has that book and he posts a picture of it. Do you know how much money I will make just from that picture of Cristiano Ronaldo post? That's capitalism. Like, you need to associate yourself with the right people at the right time. Those who have influence. Those are the ones who are able to uplift you, and then you can also uplift others who are beneath you. That's how capitalism works. But they don't explain it that way because the problem with socialism and central planning and government planning, all these social mechanisms that promote justice, they're just trying to simply maintain those who are not educated enough in a realm of being like second-class citizen. Because if you're educated, if you're too educated, you cannot be brainwashed. That's why it is hard for socialism to work on people who are educated, but it's always intellectuals who use socialism to subjugate those who are not educated enough. So capitalism, no matter what people say, capitalism is colorblind. Even African society is inherently capitalistic. Before colonialism, for instance, in Africa, we have the bartering system where people exchange the good that they have, and it was completely voluntary. If the person you're dealing with gives you a price that you don't like, you just leave. And if he needs the money, he's going to lower his price. And everybody agrees, and the exchange takes place. So that's what capitalism is. So for people who reject capitalism, it's because they want power. If you do not want power, if you want everybody to prosper in their own ways, in their own capacity, pursuing their own values and beliefs, the free market is the appropriate system to follow, is the appropriate system to implement. There is a countless examples of empirical data that show that government planning, central planning, socialism, all these planning stuff do not work on a long-term basis. They may work on a short-term period, like for a year or two, but after that, it starts deteriorating because there's an absence of price, because you compel people to do something they don't want to do. So so capitalism or the free market is based on human nature. That's my take on the free market, and that's why the free market always works long term, no matter what people say. The societies that prosper today all followed capitalism. Even China today, is a capitalistic society, although it has the Communist Party, but even the Communist Party is not really communist anymore. They're just a totalitarian or authoritarian party. But today in China, people have access to private property. That's the definition of capitalism. You need private property.
Thanks for that response. For those of us that are interested in your book and perhaps haven't read it, what are some, aside from what you've already mentioned, the biggest takeaways, main points, and facts that us lay people might find surprising from your research?
Yes, so the first thing to understand about the book is that the main thesis of the book is that what subjugated Black people to their impoverishment is not racism. It is not white privilege. I'm not saying that those things do not exist or did not exist. Of course, they did and they still exist. But what subjugated Black people to their impoverishment is the political processes, because Black people have that tendency, and it's not just Blacks, but since we're talking about Black people have that tendency to believe that their salvation will come from political power. We have more Black people in political office today than ever, and yet the Black community remains the most lagging community of the national population. The Black community alone represents 20% of the poverty rate. We're the poorest of the national population. That says a lot. So in the book, for instance, one thing that may find surprising is that I explain Reaganomics. So the political aspect of Reaganomics. A lot of people say that, yeah, Black people did not prosper under Reagan. That's not true. In fact, income per capita within the Black community increased for Black people under Reagan. Many Black people had access to political power in the 1980s, and Reagan was president in the 1980s. So this is one thing that I wanted to put in perspective so that people will understand. The low-income Black people were hurt, surely, by some of the Reagan policies, especially when it comes to law and order, when it comes to security, to mass incarceration. Yes, mass incarceration rates increased for Black people under Reagan. But the Black people who followed the rule of law, the Black people who were either middle class or upper class under Reagan prospered because their income increased. Even those in the lower brackets that were not arrested or anything, their income increased too. The data is available. It's by the US Census Bureau. You guys can check it anytime. From 1980 to 1990, income increased for Black people. So this is one essential feature that I wanted to emphasize on, because there is a myth built around it to discredit President Reagan. President Reagan was not perfect, of course. He had his flaws, he made a lot of mistakes, but to claim that Black people were worse off under Reagan is not intellectually accurate, in my opinion. So that was one feature I wanted to emphasize on. But overall, the political process is the reason why Black people are poor today, because we tend to believe that it's by putting our fellow people in office that suddenly things will go better for us. No, what we need is for people to not do anything about the market, is to let the market do its job. Create opportunities for people to have jobs. If you want to help the poor, give him a job. Because poverty, objectively speaking, is simply the absence of income. The same way the day is the absence of darkness, and the night is the absence of light, poverty is the absence of income. The minute you start earning an income, you're no longer poor. But it does not mean that you're rich either. You're no longer poor because you have income. But if, for instance, you live in an area that is above what you earn, yes, you're poor. someone who lives in Silicon Valley and making 100K a year is poor, because the living standard in Silicon Valley is at least 400 to 500K a year. So you're poor if you live in Silicon Valley making 100K, but if you use those same 100K and you live in Kentucky, you can afford a mansion with those 100K a year. So poverty is it's a relative, or I should say subjective perspective. But fundamentally speaking, poverty is simply the absence of wealth. What creates poverty? Nothing creates poverty. In fact, poverty was, the human condition was born in poverty. People never ask the right question. They always ask, oh, why people are so poor? What creates poverty? People should ask, what creates wealth? Wealth is something we create. We don't create poverty, we create wealth. And the creation of wealth demands the use of skills, the use of knowledge, and the use of capital. That's how you create wealth. And poverty is simply the negation of all these three I mentioned. That's what poverty is. So the welfare state is what creates poverty in the Black community specifically, because the welfare state negated the use of knowledge, it negated the use of skills, it negated the use of capital. The Black community is the only community that owns nothing, substantially speaking. So because we own nothing, we cannot produce, we cannot multiply what we own. And that's why we're still mentally enslaved, and we're still preaching that victimhood mentality, in my opinion.
Thanks for that detailed response. Now we have a question from a member of the Dartmouth Libertarians, Harold Tan. Take it away.
Hi. So, hi, Professor. I know you, Professor Germinal.
I'm not a professor at all. I'm not a professor. I don't have a doctorate.
Yes, I read up on you and I saw that your biggest influence is Thomas Sowell, and it's a quote from you remind me of the capitalism doesn't discriminate. The only color it cares about is green. But okay, so I want to ask more about apartheid and Jim Crow laws. So I want to ask, so with all of these historical oppression happens to Black people in America and in Africa, so did these laws actually succeeded in what they were aimed to do, which is to discriminate against Blacks? And if they didn't, then did capitalism do anything to negate these discriminatory laws?
So the purpose of these laws, of course, as you know, was to simply prevent Black people to have the same political status as whites at the time. But on the economic realm, they needed each other. During Jim Crow, Black people were working at white-owned businesses. During the apartheid, Black people were working for white families and for white-owned businesses too. So back to what Thomas Sowell said, capitalism or the free market is colorblind. We need people to apply the skills and judgment into the production of commodities or the production of goods and services. So we need that. So when you need that, you're not going to look at the skin color. You're just going to hire the guy to do the job. And that's what happened. And now there were some that were, of course, smart enough to say whatever they make, they save, and they were able to create their own thing. And there were others who did not have the essential education to understand these things. Booker T. Washington, for instance, was a prominent, wealthy Black person at a time where Jim Crow was on steroids in this country. In 1915, no, he died in 1915. So even before 1950, Booker T. Washington was already a prosperous man. If racism was the reason of all evils for Black people, how Booker T. Washington managed to reach the status he reached? And especially in the South. It's not that Booker T. Washington was living in Washington State or in Maine. No, he was living in Oklahoma, where racism was on steroids there. And still, he managed to become a prominent Black entrepreneur lifting his fellows out of poverty by giving them jobs, by educating them, by telling them that, guys, if you want to be respected, work. You need to focus on developing your skills. You need to focus on developing your work ethics. That's how you're going to be emancipated. And the result is that in the 1920s, Black self-unemployment was higher than white self-unemployment or any other race. So so that's how capitalism was able to negate all these segregationist systems.
Thanks. We have a next question from Iris. So Iris, I'm just going to spotlight you so you can ask your question.
Hi, thank you for your time today. I was wondering if you could describe a few policy interventions that you would implement today. If you could do anything, what are a few policies you would implement to remove
the burden on Black people and stuff?
Yes, to remove different forms of government regulation that have oppressed the Black community.
Okay, I'm gonna try to, okay, I'm gonna sound radical here. First, eradicate the minimum wage law. Because by eradicating the minimum wage law, any young Black teenager will be able to get a job and start learning what it means to work and gaining professional experience. Some people may say, like, oh yeah, like he's working at McDonald's flipping burgers. Yes, flipping burgers in January doesn't mean that's going to be flipping burgers in December. So it's all about helping them get understanding and gaining the discipline of working every single day. So the absence of the minimum wage law will enable them to start earning an income so that they can now build on that income and move along the income brackets and to climb the social ladder as well. Another will be to repeal the welfare state. But to repeal the welfare state, the best way to do it, in my opinion, would be to decentralize it first. Because to repeal it completely from the way it is, it will be brutal. It will be hard because people are already in it, they're dependent on it. So it would be better to decentralize it to the state level and let each state decide on how they want to implement their welfare state. And now you will see how costly it is to maintain a welfare state. There's like states like Mississippi, for example, will not be able to maintain a welfare state because the revenues there is not enough, because the welfare state is maintained by tax revenues, and income in Mississippi, it's pretty low. Mississippi is the 50th state in the country when it comes to wealth. Mississippi is the poorest. So that is the way it will be. We can disincentivize and reduce the welfare state. And then each state will start like using it, and then you will see some state that they will not be able to keep it for too long, and they will get rid of it. So these are the two main policies that I will actually repeal, and I believe that it will really help Black people to emancipate themselves economically.
Would you defund the police and get rid of government funding for a militarized police force?
Defund the police. I think before going to completely defunding the police, I think the police should be reformed first. And in areas or in states that are substantially wealthy, they can even have a privatized police, in my opinion. I think the best will be to have a privatized police. I mean, I'm definitely not an anarchist. I know there are a lot of anarchists in the libertarian movement. I'm not an anarchist, but I think the privatization of the police will be a better way to maintain law and order. Because right now the police is centralized and the laws that holds them accountable are extremely loosened. So that's why you see those cops doing whatever they want, killing whoever they want because it pleases them. So even like when people say that the police is racist, the police is racially profiling, I personally don't believe the police is racist. I think it's just a matter of power between the dominant and the subordinate. Because those guys, once they're on the street, they're the most powerful man after the president of the United States. The moment you get pulled over by the police, know that everything can go wrong at any time. Once again, I repeat, the guy has the gun, he has the handcuffs, and he has the tasers. So now it's your choice to determine how you want this to go. You can either say, yes, sir, no, sir, are we done, sir, and you're good to go. All the guy wants is for you to bound to him and to call him sir so that he feels respected. Or you can try to defy him and to fight him, and the likelihood that he will take your life will be higher. So I think even if we have to defund the police, it has to be something gradual. Because to have like a privatized police, people need to be educated about the privatization of the police, how it works and stuff like that before we can go to that level. So I think it's a gradual process. But to abruptly defund the police, I don't think it's a smart way to fix the damage.
In response to that, so I think you make a really strong point about the need to demilitarize a police force that currently gets immense federal funding for military-style weapons for small community police forces.
Yeah.
Do you think that privatization of a public good such as law keeping, would you be concerned about how privatizing that kind of a public good would go down? I mean, at a certain point, right, wouldn't that lead to privatization of education and a lot of other things that government provide that we do need public provision of? If I get shot in a neighborhood that doesn't have a privatized police force, I would still expect someone to come help me.
Yeah, that's why I said my argument that only the wealthy state can try to do that. Because the states that are like middle income or low income cannot afford privatizing the police yet. So it should be it should be done as an experiment or like, as a pilot program, just to see how it works. Even like a county, let's take like Arlington County in Virginia, for instance, which is one of the wealthiest counties in the country. People there can afford privatizing the police and see how it works. I lived there before. It's a very safe county. It's a very safe place to live in. Like nothing really happens there. The likelihood that you get mugged or anything, it's really low. So a place like that, they can definitely try to privatize the police. Now, a place like, I will say, South Chicago, to privatize the police, I don't think that would be a good idea. There, you will need the police to be centralized, but the rules have to change first. Qualified immunity and all these other laws that protect police officers, like they have to be reformed. The police have to be held accountable the same way private citizens are. That's what the rule of law is. The rule of law is and must be absolute. If we claim to be a country of laws, we must hold the law to at the same standard for every single one, from the president of the United States to the plumber. Everybody have to be held accountable to the same standard. And that's why the problem is with the police. They're not held accountable to the same standard as you or I. That's why they allow themselves to act like thugs, I would say, because some police officers use that badge as not as a privilege to serve the community, but they use it as an abuse of power, and that's where my problem is with them. So the police have to be reformed first.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Do you mind if I ask one more follow-up related to that?
Please. I actually have a follow-up related to something you asked, so I'll ask that once you're done. Please.
So, you made a point about how disproportionately Black and Latinx individuals are unfairly targeted by the criminal justice system, and you mentioned part of it is because of potentially where both police brutality and where people are caught doing minor offenses like minor drug offenses, for example. And I would imagine the libertarian approach to the war on drugs would be decriminalizing everything, legalizing everything. But my other question is, what do we do in terms of providing employment opportunities for people who have been released from prison or who now have permanent criminal records? Because in the US, there is, I mean, just today, at least I think across the country, there is immense discrimination against people with any sort of criminal record, even minor arrests. And that really gets in the way of employment and free market and opportunities for prosperity, as you were saying.
So for that, I think the federal government should implement a law or a legislation that will negate the intensity of the background check, if that makes sense. So of course, a background check should be done. However, if the person has a misdemeanor or a really minor offense, a law should be implemented in the way that it does not completely discriminate or disqualify that applicant from getting a job. So if that law is implemented, it could be then applied on businesses. Because if we also let just businesses doing whatever they want on that, then a lot of people will not get a job. Because honestly, no business wants to hire someone who has a criminal record. People don't feel comfortable doing that. So that's where government intervention could be necessary. That's what government intervention could be a necessary evil. So if government implements a law that compels, for instance, businesses to say, hey, when you conduct your background check, do not discriminate against people who have a misdemeanor, that could definitely help people who were convicted for minor offenses to be fully rehabilitated in society again. Because the problem is that, you know, with a misdemeanor, like you cannot even rent an apartment, you cannot take a loan at the bank, you cannot get a job, and it's really problematic. So that's where like lawmakers should focus. They should try to implement a law that will help former inmates get a second chance in society to provide for themselves. Otherwise, they will be in that social prison for the rest of their lives, and that's a huge issue, I think.
Okay, thanks, Iris, for all those awesome questions, and thank you, Germinal, of course, for answering them. Mwesige has a question that he'd like to ask, and he hasn't asked something yet, so I'd like him to go before Harold.
Yes, I don't know. Good afternoon there, I think. This is morning. It's a morning. It's a Tuesday morning. Actually, it's 13 minutes to 2 in the morning. It's midnight. Actually, it's night here. People are all asleep. Jonathan, thank you very much for this wonderful discussion. Thank you very much, Mr. Germinal, for a wonderful presentation. I'm Mwesige Joram from Uganda, Africa. I work with a libertarian organization called Action for Liberty and Economic Development. Actually, my question is about government, philosophy of governance. Government seems to be a wrong idea. In the previous society, for example, the ancestral Africa, we did not have this arranged, centralized system of governance that took power from people and used it to abuse the citizen. So my question would be, is the philosophy of government really sounding? Is the philosophy of government really civilized? For example, if you look at democracy, is democracy that empowers people to become dictator? Is it a serious idea? Is democracy a serious idea? If you also look at socialism, that most people around the world cherish, is it the best idea to govern humanity across the world? Or we should go as Germinal? For us, we believe in a voluntary society. we live in a free society where an individual is supreme over his life and the entire society. Thank you very much, Jonathan.
It's all
So
Germinal.
if I clearly understand the question, are you asking about kind of like the philosopher king that will rule government?
No, the idea of government and its principles, such as democracy, socialism, are they the best ideas we should take, or we should go back for a voluntary society which existed a long time back, where we did not have a government that compelled us and bring incentivized idea like democracy. We go and vote for those people to take our liberties and rights.
Okay, I think I understand the question now. So first of all, I think aside from authoritarianism, I think democracy is a terrible system. It's one, I genuinely hate democracy because it's you have 51% deciding for the 49% what life should be. And among the 51%, you have people who are not educated enough to understand all the complex features of life that are at stake. And yet they vote out of impulses. That's one of the reasons why I don't like democracy. I think a republic is the best kind of system, which is what we have in the United States, but it has to be a decentralized republic. By decentralized, I mean the government has to be substantially minimal, like it has to go all the way to the local sphere. I think like that's how you give back power to the communities. That's how you give back people's liberty. Because when government is that reduced, people can directly be involved in the political activities that take place. The more centralized it becomes, the more bureaucracy we have. And that's what happened in Africa, especially after the colonial era. The socialism that happened in Africa is simply the product of colonialism, because we saw and learned from the colonial rule how decisions were made. There was like one group or one person that was making decisions for thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. And it's basically the commanding style, the Soviet commanding style, where it's like top down. And that's how even African societies are now structured, the top-down society. So for people to get back their liberties, the system has to be completely decentralized. The people have to be trusted. They have to be trusted that they can make the right decisions for themselves. The truth is, no one knows yourself better than you. And unfortunately, we now have that tendency to believe, and it's not just in Africa, but also in America and everywhere else on this planet. We have that tendency to believe that those in power, the bureaucrats, know better than ourselves what is good for ourselves. The bureaucrats are living in that foolishness of their education because they went to the best schools, they got their doctorate, so they think that they know better than you what's good for you. And that's where the problem is. So decentralization, localism are the systems that can help communities, that can help ordinary citizens to have their liberties back. It will help them get the liberty back. It will also allow them to hold their local political leaders accountable directly. Because right now, like, you live in Ghana, so let's say you live in Kumasi, and Nana Akufo, the president of Ghana, who lives in Accra, is making a decision. He's making a decision and he doesn't even know what's going on in your life. So he's making a decision based on not knowing what everybody needs. And that's what the problem is. So if the system was decentralized, if you live in Kumasi and the system is decentralized, the issues that you go through in Kumasi will be dealt there, because the power of government will be only limited there. So that's how you give back power, liberty, and freedom to people, to ordinary citizens, generally speaking.
Sorry, Mosige, do you have a follow-up question? Also, sorry for butchering the pronunciation.
No, Jomina, I clearly pick his point. It's wonderful, actually, from him. And I'm privileged to always meet you, Germinal, to discuss this idea of a free society. Thank you very much, Jonathan.
No problem, man. No problem.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Now Harold had another question, so I'm going to call on him.
Hi, it's me again. And,
Hi.
Yeah, so back then, like let's say 2 years ago when I was in the conservative camp, I would probably say that, what is it called? Systemic racism doesn't exist. But the more I become more libertarian, I agree with the progressive people that systemic racism do exist. But so I have or systemic oppression do exist. So I have an examples of my family. So my aunt is a hairdresser, and for some reason she needs to take a license class that costs $10,000 just in a whole year, like what's it called, mandatory class, just to be a hairdresser. So this is what I see as the real systemic oppression, the real systemic racism that's really keeping the poor people down. But then how come that the progressive, or like, you know, everyone always rallying about systemic oppression, no one really talk about licensing and barriers to entry that are actually really oppressing people?
Yeah, like actually you're right. That's the real oppression, because Milton Friedman used to say that in the 1910s and 1920s, you know, that time when the US was very prosperous, the flux of immigration was significant. A lot of people were coming from everywhere because there was no regulations at the time. So you can start a job without having to get a license for it. Of course, the only professions that have been always licensed or regulated were the legal profession and the medical profession. But beside that, every other job, you want to become a beautician, you want to become a hairdresser, you didn't have a license for that. So that's why it helped Black people to have a higher self-unemployment rate than others, because there was no regulations. But now that the government has been regulating those professions, it's harder for people. They get the certificate or the degree they need. They have to take extra classes, and then they have to take like certification exams, and all this money, where does it go? It goes to the government. It goes to the one who is regulating those things. So I agree, like the real oppression is not, it's more about like the government implementing those regulatory rules to keep the poor poorer. So government is responsible for that systemic oppression. So I would not say like it's systemic racism. I mean, systemic racism has existed in this country, but it no longer plays the role that it used to play during Jim Crow. But there is definitely a systemic oppressive system in this country, and the government is that thing that is oppressing ordinary people like you and I, like everyone. It's the government that is responsible for that oppression. It's the government that is responsible for the impoverishment of Black people, because racism could have played no role in this country if the government did not allow it. That's the thing. Because a racist person cannot harm you unless the government doesn't hold that person accountable at all. And that's what happened. That's what Jim Crow occurred. In the book, I even explained that the government failed to protect the constitutional rights of Black people, because Black people had the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, which allowed Black people to be seen, to be perceived as first class or full legal citizens like white people. and the 15th Amendment, which allow Black people to vote. Those rights were there in the 19th century, and the federal government did nothing. They applied the rule of states' rights. Oh, states have the right to decide whatever they want to do. That's why people implement Jim Crow. The rights of minorities were trumped for almost a century, completely trumped for almost a century. So it was the federal government who failed to protect the rights of minorities, who failed to protect the rights of Black people. That's why Jim Crow occurred. That's why this systemic racism we're talking about occurs. It's the government who created it. If the federal government protected Black people against the coercive power of states and local governments, there will be no Jim Crow at all. Simple as that. There will be no Jim Crow. But because the federal government did nothing, there is. And now people expect the federal government to fix the problems that it has created itself. Let's be real.
Yeah, can I have a follow-up question?
Yeah, go for it, Harold.
Yeah, so it's to perplex me, like, if everyone, like, I think you wrote an essay on social justice, it's not really justice or something like that. And so why are the people who are fighting for social justice not really fighting this licensing or this discriminatory laws at all? And can we do anything about it?
Because it's not fun. Because they're not seen as heroes. That's why. You know, if you go and claim that you care about people, you care for the environment, you're seen as a hero. People do not fight about those things because there's nothing interested about it. It's like if you come and claim that you believe in the free market, you believe like in work ethics and some traditional values and stuff like that, you're not fun. But if you come and say that, yes, you believe that the environment is dying because of capitalism, so we need to tax CO2, we need to tax corporation, we need to do this and that, then people will clap for you. So social justice in itself is a myth because the foundation of social justice is not even solid. Like it's what justice are you trying to restore? Justice is always restored in a court of law. If I wronged you, you will take me to court because I offended you. That's where justice is administered. But what justice you try to restore when the one who created that injustice itself is the government? And people are just in that illusion to make themselves feel better. I think it's because social justice is a myth. It's not real. There's no legal foundation of social justice. That's the thing. There's no legal foundation for it because justice means that you're trying to do justice because there is a wrong that has been committed between two parties. But social justice, like the rich are richer, the poor are poorer. Like what justice you're trying to restore here? If you're poor and you don't like your condition, just change your habits, do things that you used to not do, start working, start saving. The savings you have, start to create capital, invest in that, and that's how you're gonna lift yourself out of poverty. There's no miracle to transition from poverty to wealth. It's just work. So I don't know what social justice people are trying to advocate for.
Thanks, Harold. Do you have another follow-up question, or is that all? All right, then I'd like to call on Bryden next.
Great. So my question is, how do we convince those with more centralist political orientations that free markets are the most effective engines for social welfare? It seems as though many with those beliefs, at least those encountered, are influenced more by compassion and narrative than they are by just pure reasoning. I know a common image that's evoked is, for example, you can't raise a family of 4 on $7.25 an hour, and that's an argument to like raise the minimum wage. So how do you respond to that?
So I think the best way is first to understand people's issues and their stories. People just want to be heard. So when someone tells you that he believes in central planning and socialism, don't be dismissive. Don't dismiss the person. Listen to what he or she has to say. Let them speak, tell you their story. And then now you bring up the free market explain that in a anecdotal way. And then use now some empirical evidence to back your arguments. Because if you try to convince people straight from the scientific method, people will not listen to you. It's more like an emotional thing. So when you're dealing with someone emotional, use also emotions to speak reason, but do not be cold and like try to be too rational to explain to them, because people want to be comforted in their beliefs. So when you want to take someone out of his beliefs, use the same features that he or she uses to believe in what he believes, and then tell them the opposite of what they believe. And when someone, for instance, like I explained in one of my books that the problem why the minimum, like raising the minimum wage will not increase living wage is because the minimum wage is simply based on the market value. So every time they raise the minimum wage, the market value increases too. So they will never match. They will never match because the market value increased, the minimum wage increased, inflation increased. So it's like chasing your tail. It's like a dog chasing his own tail, and he will never reach it. And that's what people don't understand. So I think it's more about how you explain. It's more about the semantic, how you explain to people that socialism, central planning, government planning doesn't work. It's more about how you explain to them. But for people to be receptive, you have to listen to them first. And that was one of the issues I have with Candace Owens, is that she's extremely dismissive when she's trying to reason people. And that's why she's that headed. People want to be heard. Just let them speak, let them feel loved, let them feel that someone is hearing them, is listening to them. And that's how you can now bring them to your side. And that's one thing that Bill Clinton is extremely skillful at. Bill Clinton was able to make a Republican becoming a Democrat, because Bill Clinton will listen to every single thing you have to say before he gives his side of the argument. And then once he's done speaking, you're convinced that I should be a Democrat. All the whole Democrats have horrible policies, in my opinion. But that's what it's about. It's all about patience, and especially the semantic.
Thanks for that response, Germinal. I know that something that you talk about a lot on your social media and posts is the importance of empiricism and knowledge, logos, in talking to people about such, charged subject matter. But I think it's in terms of actually reaching people's hearts and minds, minds and actually their hearts, I guess I didn't phrase a little bit, the anecdotal kind of relating to where they're coming from morally, emotionally is certainly an important thing to do.
Oh yeah, it is important. It is important, because if you try to start from the empirical part, people will be like, I don't have time for that. Yeah, no, they won't, because the thing is, like, people don't have time to sit down and do research all day. So they want something that could be dumbed down to them. And that's why I gave the example of Bill Clinton, because he was great at that. Although Bill Clinton is a very intelligent man. He's like one of the most educated presidents of the history of the US, but he was able to dumb down to people so that people will feel comfortable being around them. I even explained that in the book too. I started that chapter, the last chapter of the book, I started by describing who Bill Clinton is, not was because he's still alive, but who Bill Clinton was as a politician, and why people even call him the first black president. Everybody felt comfortable with him. I don't know if you heard that, but there is a dictum that says that when Hillary comes when Hillary comes somewhere, she darkens the room, and when Bill Clinton comes somewhere, he he enlightens the room. He brightens and Hillary darkens it. So that's, yeah, like I saw that in one documentary I watched about like Hillary and Trump, why Hillary lost to Trump. So that was really interesting. And that's how I learned, like, when you're having an argument, when you're trying to convince someone who does not see eye to eye with you, listen to them, let them tell you their story. And then based on everything they tell you, now propose a solution package. It's like sales. It's like sales. You know, the customer comes, he's going to tell you all about his life and blah, blah, blah. Yes, sir. Yes. Oh, I understand, sir. And then once he's done telling everything he or she has to say, you compute like a solution package and say, this is how I believe that it will work for you. Done.
I love that analogy. I have a final question to ask since I didn't get any more in the general chat. Something that Iris said while she was asking her questions, she discussed public school as a public good. You know, that is something non-rivalrous, non-excludable. I think most of us here understand what the definition is. And that, you know, it's really important because it provides equal opportunity for kids. And, you know, regardless where adults end up and where the law of responsibility, as Bastiat would put it, takes them, that's on them. But I think all of us here would agree, kind of morally and in our heart of hearts, that, you know, children should have equal access. And I think that something implicitly that Iris intimated in her question was that public education is the way to do that. And I was wondering if in your book you discuss how public education and the system through which, you know, it's funded through property tax, et cetera, at least the way it's structured now, would you say it's been helpful to Black children in the United States?
To some degree, but if you look at it, if you look at the data, for instance, the achievement gap keeps widening instead of narrowing. It tells you something. I believe that public schools should be maintained. However, we should use privatization methods. And one privatization method to make public schools even more efficient is to use the voucher system. Because the thing is, like, the thing with public schools is that based on the neighborhood you live in, that's where you're assigned to send your kid to school. That is dictatorial, in my opinion. If people are not able to choose which school they want to send their kids to, there's no freedom. And today, that's what it is. I mean, if you live in a nice neighborhood, good for you, sure. Even the public school in your neighborhood, it's a quality public school. But for those who live in low-income neighborhoods, the public school they have to send their kids to, it's rotten. It's literally devaluating education. Like, the kid will probably never get a job, and it's like basically dooming the kid. So one way to make public school more efficient is to create more charter schools. That's what Thomas Sowell published his latest book, Charter Schools and Their Enemies. Because charter schools are simply public schools that are privately managed. So when you have a school that is privately managed, there is usually discipline that is implemented. There is like a cultural system that is implemented in which like the students are developing there. It's all about the culture of the school, because one of the reasons why public schools make low-income people fail is because the culture that is within these schools is a poor culture. It is a culture that does not promote work ethics. It is a culture that does not promote discipline. It is a culture that does not promote ambition. It is a culture that promotes only teachers to care about themselves. And those, that's why, like, you know, those teachers, they're like unionized. So it's really difficult for public schools to have incentive to do things better. So if there is a voucher system that is implemented, or if there is a way to make people who go to public school go into charter schools, that will help significantly low-income people to make progress and to assure a future for the kids. So I think that's the best way, in my opinion, to help low-income people moving forward with the education of their children when it comes to public school.
Thanks for that really nuanced and informed answer. I can't say I've read Thomas Sowell's latest book, but I myself actually went to one of these pseudo public schools. So there's a set of schools, a limited set, I think there are 8 in New York City, called the specialized high schools, and they're totally publicly funded, but they're not district. And instead of there being a lottery, there's this test that's administered, and you just get in based on how you perform on the test relative to everybody else. So I ended up going to Bronx Science, which in my opinion is the best of them, but it's definitely in the top 3, objectively speaking.
Yeah.
Do you think that having kids, even from really early ages before high school, compete for, let's say, the best of these schools is a way to do it? Because generally, I think us as free market libertarians are pro-competition. And I've personally experienced how competition in this space between students has led to a school where the culture was, and most of the students, before free lunch was made for all kids, 70% of my school was on free lunch. I mean, this was a generally working class, poor cohort of kids, but the culture was so committed to the work ethic, and the teachers promoted that. And, you know, students from my school do extraordinarily well in college and moving on to professional work. So could that kind of school also be a solution?
Yeah, I mean, competition makes everything better. But of course, like, you can also have an excess of competition, because if competition is too much, the kids will not focus on learning. They will just focus on getting the best grades and then move on. The problem with that is that, first, I'm the kind of student, I never cared about grades. I always cared about learning. I was generally a B- student. So to me, getting an A would make my life better. I mean, that's my personal opinion. I mean, sure, getting an A may take you to higher places, but I personally believe that to me, like, it negates the learning part. I'm someone who have to learn. Like, that's why I strongly believe in self-education, like, because I want to learn the thing for the sake of learning. I don't want to do the thing just to get an A and not remember anything else. So, you know, but yes, competition is important for kids to develop a work ethics, because if you tell them that there's a prize to win, if they do well, they will unlock their potential. So I think everything has to be nuanced. Competition should be the basis, but it should not be used in excess as well, because the excess will make those kids becoming more like concerned with grades rather than learning. And at the end of the day, you want individuals who are able to learn something so they can develop the skills that they've learned. So I think things should be nuanced, but definitely the system that you've talked about should be like, it should be based on competition, because it will definitely help kids unlocking their potential and do better than they should, than they're basically doing right now, I'll say.
All right, that will conclude the official portion of our lecture and Q&A session with Mr. Germinal G. Van. I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and I'd like to thank Germinal for answering these questions and presenting us all these themes and information from his latest book.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you.